What follows is reconstructed from three sources: the official field notes of National Park Service, Fire Lookout Elias Vane, stationed at Thoroughfare Station in the back country of Yellowstone National Park during the summer and fall of 1953, a partial transcript of radio communications recovered from the NPS archives in 1987, and a single handwritten letter addressed to no one, found tucked inside the floorboards of the lookout cabin when it was decommissioned in 1961. The Park Service classified Vane's final report under an administrative designation that no longer exists, in a file category that was discontinued before most of the people reading this were born. It took a Freedom of Information request filed by a retired ranger named Doris Harverson, a woman who had known Vane briefly and never stopped thinking about what he'd told her before he disappeared, to surface any of this at all. Harverson's notes, appended to her FOIA request, described Vane as someone who did not exaggerate. She wrote, "Elias was the most careful observer I ever met in 202 years of Park Service work. If he said a thing happened, it happened. He had served 2 tours in Korea as a forward observer, a job that required not just courage, but the ability to describe terrain, distance, and movement with absolute precision under conditions that would unmake most people. He was hired by the NPS in 1951 on the strength of a letter from his battalion commander who described him as, quote, possessed of the sharpest pair of eyes and the most reliable judgment of any man he had commanded. Elias Vane was not a man who saw things that weren't there. He arrived at Thoroughfare Station in late May of 1953, having ridden in by horseback with a season's worth of supplies and a hand-drawn map that he later noted was, in several important respects, wrong. Thoroughfare Station sits in the most remote corner of Yellowstone, 40 miles from the nearest road by the shortest available trail, deeper into the wilderness than almost any other staffed point in the lower 48 states. The Yellowstone River passes close enough to hear from the tower's catwalk on quiet mornings, a low, continuous rush that Vane noted was the only sound besides wind that was perfectly consistent. The terrain is technically within the park's boundaries, but practically beyond the reach of any meaningful supervision, a fact that Vane noted in his first week's report with neither complaint nor commentary, simply as a logistical observation. The way a man who has served in a remote forward position notes the distance to the nearest Allied unit. His daily life at the station was structured and deliberate, which suited him. He rose before first light, made coffee on the propane camp stove, and climbed the 70ft staircase to the cab in the grey pre-dawn. He swept the tree line with his binoculars at first light, then at mid-morning, then at midday, then at the late afternoon hours when heat and low light could make distant smoke harder to read against a hazy sky. He recorded weather data at standardized intervals: temperature, dew point, relative humidity, wind speed, wind direction. He logged cloud type and cover percentage. He noted the condition of the fuel load in each quadrant of his observation area, how dry the undergrowth looked, whether the needle litter had that brittle pale quality that precedes fast ignition. At nightfall, he climbed back down, ate whatever he'd prepared, read by lantern light. He'd brought a crate of paperback books and a collection of military history he'd been meaning to get through for years, and wrote in his green-covered field journal before sleeping. He filled 12 of these notebooks over the course of that season. 11 of them are in the public record. The 12th has never been found. The first 11 notebooks describe a man settling into the rhythms of extreme isolation with something close to contentment. He writes about the patterns of elk movement through the valley below the tower. He notes which drainage the herds prefer in the cool of morning, where they bed in the afternoon heat. He catalogues bird species with the same disciplined precision he'd used to log enemy positions in Korea. Species, count, location, behavior, time of observation. He notes the dates and directions of thunderstorms and records which areas of forest looked driest and most vulnerable to ignition after periods of low humidity. He is methodical in the way that people who have survived genuinely dangerous situations tend to be methodical, because they understand at a cellular level that sloppiness costs you, and the price of sloppiness in terrain like this is one you pay fully. It is not until the third week of July, Notebook 6, page 41, that anything changes. If stories like this are what you're here for, hit subscribe. New ones come every week, and you probably don't want to miss what's coming next. The entry for July 19th reads in full: observed unusual track, pattern in the mud. Along the eastern fork this afternoon. Initially read as elk, but the stride length is wrong by approximately 14 in too long, and the depth suggests a weight significantly greater than any elk I've seen on this range. Additionally, the rear print is partially overlapping the front in a pattern inconsistent with cervid locomotion. Photographed tracks. We'll compare against field guides tonight. He compared them against every reference he had. He sent the photographs to the district ranger office in his bi-weekly packet with a note asking for confirmation on species identification. The response he received 2 weeks later was a single-typed, tracks consistent with mature bull elk. Continue monitoring. Elias Vane wrote in the margin of his copy of that response. They didn't look at the photographs. The tracks reappeared 4 days later, this time on the north ridge above the tower's sightline. Same stride length, same impossible depth, same wrong overlap between front and rear print. He measured them again with the same metal tape he used for fire spread estimates. He noted that the front print, the one that should be a hoof impression, had a quality he described as bifurcated at the forward edge, not in the manner of a cloven hoof, but more as though whatever made the track had a secondary forward projection, like a spur or a claw grown separately from the main contact surface. He was careful in his notes not to speculate beyond what he could directly observe. He had been trained to describe, not to interpret. That discipline held. What he could directly observe by the end of July was this: something large was moving through the forest east of the tower in a regular patterned route. It traveled roughly north to south and back again on a cycle that took approximately 3 days to complete. It did not appear to graze as large ungulates do. There were no browsing marks on the low vegetation along its route, no cropped tips on the brush, no evidence of feeding at any point along the path. It did not leave scat. It did not appear to disturb the vegetation randomly the way a feeding animal moves. Its route was consistent, almost geometric in its regularity, and the animals that shared the terrain with it were doing something that Vane found more unsettling than any of the track evidence. Prey animals that crossed its route turned and fled immediately, not from a scent trail, not from a sound, but from the mere fact of the ground it had walked on. He requested, in his August 3rd report packet, permission to conduct a half-day tracking excursion into the eastern drainage to get better documentation of whatever was making those prints. Permission was denied. The stated reason was fire season operational priorities. Lookout personnel were not to leave their observation areas during the high-risk period. Vane noted, without editorial comment, that it had rained heavily for 6 of the previous 8 days, and the fire risk index for his sector was, by any objective measure, the lowest it had been since he arrived. He kept watching. He was good at watching. The first sighting came on August 11th at approximately 6:40 in the evening, which was about 40 minutes before full dark. Vane was doing his final sweep of the tree line before signing off for the night. He'd done this sweep hundreds of times. He knew the geometry of that tree line the way a man who had studied something daily for 3 months knows it. Not just the shape, but the logic, where it broke and where it closed, which gaps were permanent and which shifted with the angle of light. His entry for August 11th is longer than any previous entry in the recovered journals. At 18:42, movement at the southeastern tree line, approximately 800 YD from the tower base. Initial impression, standing figure, corrected to standing figure of unusual height. The tree line there consists of mature lodgepole pines, which in this section stand between 40 and 50 ft. The figure appeared to reach approximately the height of the lower branches, which would place it at between 20 and 25 ft tall. This is not consistent with any known species. I watched it for approximately 4 minutes. It did not move in the manner of a tree moving in wind. It stood still for 3.5 of those 4 minutes, and then it turned. I want to be precise about this. It rotated slowly in a manner entirely consistent with a deliberate act of turning to face a different direction. At that point, it moved northward along the tree line and was lost to my view behind the ridge. I have no explanation for what I observed. I am recording it accurately. He did not call it in that night. He sat with it. He made dinner and ate without tasting it, and then sat at the desk for a while with the lantern lit, not reading, not writing, just sitting. He slept, or approximated sleep, and by morning he had constructed several rational explanations. A fire snag he'd miscalculated the distance to, a standing dead tree in the gap he hadn't catalogued, a shadow effect created by the low angle of the evening light through the pines. He noted all of these explanations in the next morning's entry and added, with the same even-handedness he brought to everything else, that none of them quite accounted for the rotation. A snag doesn't rotate. A shadow doesn't move northward at a consistent pace. He saw it again on August 15th. This time, he was ready with the binoculars when it appeared, and he had gone back to his army habits. He had pre-measured the distance to that section of tree line the previous afternoon. Using the method his battalion had used for establishing range cards, walking out with a measured rope, confirming against known landmarks, cross-checking with his compass. The distance was 760 YD. The figure was precisely at the tree line. The lower branches of the lodgepoles at that point were, by his own ground measurement made before the season began, 42 ft from the ground. The figure's head, he used the word head while noting that he could not make out specific features at that distance in failing light, came level with those branches. It was standing still. It was facing the tower. He wrote, I had the strong impression that it was aware of me. He called it in the next morning once he'd let the night settle, and confirmed that what he'd written in the previous evening's entry still accurately represented what he'd seen. He described what he'd observed with the same language he'd used to pull in targets in Korea. Distance, bearing, physical descriptors, duration of observation, confidence level assigned to each element of the report. The district office asked him to hold. He held for 11 minutes, which he noted because 11 minutes is a long time to keep a backcountry lookout on an open radio frequency when there's no apparent communication issue at either end. When someone came back on the line, it was not the ranger he usually spoke with. The voice identified itself as representing the superintendent's office. Vane wrote the name carefully in his notes, and that name has been redacted in every version of the released documents. And that voice told him that his report had been received and would be looked into. Also told him, in language Vane transcribed in full, going forward, unusual wildlife observations of a non-emergency nature should be held for the weekly written packet rather than radioed in. We want to keep the frequency clear for fire and safety traffic. Vane wrote beneath the transcription, it was 760 YD from the tower. I have binocular confirmation. I have prior range measurements. I want the record to be clear on that. He did not call it in again. Not because he stopped seeing it, he didn't, but because he understood, with the quiet clarity of a man who had watched a military bureaucracy function under pressure, what had just happened. Someone in an office in Mammoth or Cheyenne had made a decision. He had been in the army. He recognized the shape of an administrative burial when he saw one. The careful language, the procedural redirection, the name that was never going to be attached to anything in writing. He understood that calling it in again would not surface what was happening. It would only surface him, and in a way that would almost certainly result in his removal from the station before he'd had time to understand what he was looking at. What he did instead was document. He was a forward observer. He knew how to record. September came with cold nights, and the smell of sulfur drifting up from the thermal areas to the west, that sharp mineral bite that reminded him on certain mornings of cordite. The fire season wound down. The atmospheric risk dropped. Vane's field reports grew longer and denser, filled with the kind of observation that a man who has stopped caring whether anyone reads his reports and started writing for the record will produce. He had stopped writing for the district office. He was writing for whoever came after. He had now observed the figure. He called it the subject in his notes, borrowing from the reporting language he'd used in Korea for unidentified contact on 11 separate occasions. He had established that it appeared most consistently in the hour before full dark, that it showed a preference for the eastern drainage, and that it appeared to be following a route that brought it progressively closer to the tower with each successive appearance. In mid-August, the confirmed distance had been 760 YD. By September 6th, it had appeared at 380 YD. He had also begun to notice other things, and he recorded them alongside the sightings without drawing explicit connections, letting the dates speak. The bird activity within a quarter-mile of the tower had ceased almost entirely. Not gradually, he had a dated species log going back to June, but abruptly, over the course of a week in late August, beginning at almost exactly the same time the figure had started appearing closer. The elk that had Previo. Usley used a game trail passing within sight of the tower base had rerouted, coming no closer than half a mile east of its former path. Vane did not state that these things were caused by the subject. He was too careful for that. He simply recorded them in the same journal on the same pages with the same numbered dates, and let the pattern exist in the record without editorial comment. The closer it came, the more clearly he could see it. By September, He had worked through the possibilities the way he'd have worked through a targeting problem, with limited intel, systematically ruling out each option with the evidence he had, not the evidence he wished he had. It was not an elk. It was not a moose. It was not a grizzly or black bear in any posture or behavioral mode he had observed or that was documented in the reference materials available to him at the station. He noted that it appeared to be bipedal, moving on two limbs rather than four, while adding a careful qualifier. I am aware that bears are known to rear and walk upright briefly. What I am observing is inconsistent with that behavior in duration, in posture, and most specifically in gait. It does not shuffle. It does not hold the awkward, compressed posture of a rearing bear. It moves with what I can only describe as deliberate economy of motion. It moves like something that walks upright, because that is how it moves. By September 10th, it had come within 200 YD. At 200 YD in good glass, with the angle of the late sun coming over the ridge behind him and laying direct light on the southeastern tree line, Elias Vane could see enough to write the following. Subject height remains consistent with prior estimates, approximately 20 ft. The coloration is consistent across all 11 sightings. I would describe it as the color of old timber left to weather, a deep gray-black that does not catch or reflect light the way fur does. The surface texture at this distance does not resolve into fur, feathers, or scaled surface. It appears almost smooth, or if not smooth, then with a texture too fine to read at this range. The head, if that is the correct term, is large relative to the body in a ratio more consistent with primate anatomy than with any cervid or bear. The eyes, and I am writing this sentence with full awareness of how it reads, the eyes appear to reflect ambient light in a manner I associate with nocturnal predators. There are two of them. They are approximately where you would expect eyes to be on a face oriented in your direction. At 18:54, it turned and moved north along the tree line as it has done before, and I watched it until I lost it behind the ridge, and then I sat down on the cab floor because my legs had stopped cooperating, and I thought it was better to sit than to fall. He wrote nothing more that evening. The next morning's entry begins with the weather report, temperature, wind, humidity, in the same steady hand, covering 3 lines before he returned to what had happened. Ray, yesterday I am not frightened. Or rather, I am, but the fear is not what I expected it to be. It is not the fear of being in immediate danger. It is the fear of understanding something that I was not meant to understand, and not knowing what to do with that understanding. I have been in situations where my life was at demonstrable risk, and this does not feel the same way. This feels like being looked at by something that has been watching for much longer than I have been watching back, and that feeling does not translate into any category of threat response I was trained for. On September 14th, the subject came to the base of the tower. Vane heard it first. He was in the cab at the desk preparing his evening report for transmission. He heard from below, not from the forest, but from the ground immediately beneath the structure, the sound of weight on gravel. Not the random skitter of a small animal, not the casual approach of a deer. Something was moving deliberately across the loose stone below him, and then it stopped, and the stopping was as deliberate as the moving had been. He wrote later that the sound of approach was wrong in a specific way he had trouble articulating. Too slow for the weight, too careful, as though it was being considerate of the noise it was making. He did not go to the window. He stayed at the desk with the pencil in his hand, and he wrote in real time what he was hearing. because he was a forward observer, and that was what forward observers did when they could not act. They recorded. The sounds continued for approximately 22 minutes. During those 22 minutes, Vane recorded the initial approach across gravel, the cessation of movement at a point he estimated to be directly beneath the cab, a sound he described as low and resonant, well below the threshold of what he would classify as vocalization, but clearly produced by a living thing with mass and with intention. Then silence for a period he estimated at 4 minutes. Then the sound of movement again, receding northward across the gravel, and then gone, absorbed by the forest floor beyond the clearing. Then nothing, just the river and the wind in the pines and his own heartbeat, which he noted was elevated but regular. He transmitted his regular evening report at 19:15, weather, humidity, wind direction, fire risk assessment low. He did not mention what had happened beneath the tower. He understood by then that mentioning it would accomplish nothing useful and might accelerate whatever administrative decision was being prepared about him in an office he'd never seen. In the journal below the transcribed record of sounds, he wrote, "I am now certain that it knows where I am. I am less certain about what it intends. I have been trying to determine whether uncertainty about intention constitutes a reason to remain or a reason to leave. I have not resolved that question." The letter found inside the floorboards is not dated. It is addressed, as noted earlier, to no one. Based on the specific details it contains and the condition of the paper relative to the surrounding journal materials, the archivists who examined it in 1987 placed its composition sometime in the last 2 weeks of September 1953, the final 2 weeks of Vane's documented presence at Thoroughfare Station. The letter reads, in the portions that remained fully legible after 34 years in a floorboard cavity, "I don't know if anyone will find this. The regular packets go out, but I've stopped trusting that all the right things are in them by the time they reach the district office. I want someone to know, whoever you are, whenever you're reading this, that I was careful. I was as careful as I know how to be, and I saw what I saw, and what I saw was real." It's been coming closer every night now, not on the old 3-day pattern, every night or nearly. Last night, it was at the base again, directly beneath the cab, and I could hear it there for over an hour. I've started sleeping with the radio on, not because I intend to call for help, but because the static sounds like something other than silence, and I need that right now. The silence in this country has a weight to it that it didn't have in June. I've been trying to figure out what it wants. That's a strange thing to write about something that may not be capable of wanting in any sense I understand, but it has a pattern, and it has a direction, and it has been moving toward this tower for 2 months now, and I have to call that something. I have to put a word to it, or the only words left are the ones I don't want to use. I know what it is not. It's not anything in the field guides. It's not anything the Park Service has documented, or if they have, no one who was going to tell me about it did. I've been thinking about the Shoshone stories about this country, the ones the old-timer at the supply depot told me before I came in for the season, about certain places in the back country that sensible people didn't settle or linger in, and certain times of year when the country to the east of the river should be left to whatever lived there first. He told me those stories the way you tell a useful piece of local knowledge, not to frighten me, not as legend, but as practical information about the terrain. The way you tell someone new to a district that a particular ford is faster in the afternoon when the snowmelt drops. Just This is what you should know about this country. I wish I'd asked him more questions. I wish I'd asked him what happened to the people who didn't stay back from those places. If it comes again tonight, I'm going to go to the window and look at it properly. I know how that sounds, but I have spent 20 years learning that the way through something you don't understand is by understanding it. You look at it. You describe what you see. You put it in the record as accurately as you can, and then you deal with what comes from that. That's what I know how to do. I just wanted someone to know that I was careful, that whatever is in these notes, whatever gets recovered, whatever gets filed or buried, it was all accurate. I was not a man who made things up. I was not a man who panicked. I was not a man who didn't look at what was in front of him. There, the letter ends. Elias Vane's final radio transmission was logged on September 29, 1953 at 19:07. The transmission was received clearly with no irregularities noted by the receiving operator. His weather report was routine. His fire risk assessment was low. He signed off in the standard manner, and the frequency went quiet, and the frequency stayed quiet. The Park Service sent a ranger to check on him when he missed his October 4th transmission window. Then a second, when the first reported nothing conclusive. Then a third. The ranger who reached Thorofare Station on October 9th, the first person on the ground thereafter Vane went silent, filed an incident report that is notable for a specific absence. The cabin was intact. The radio was functional. The camp stove had been recently used. The lantern had oil in it and was trimmed. Everything was in its place. Any backcountry ranger will tell you why that detail should have been the most alarming thing in the report. When someone leaves a remote post in distress, they leave evidence of distress. They don't put the lantern back. They don't hang their coat on the hook. They don't close the journal and set the pencil neatly beside it. If the situation allowed time to tidy up before leaving, it wasn't an emergency exit. And if it wasn't an emergency exit, then wherever Elias Vane went, he went with some degree of intention. The 11 field notebooks were on the shelf above the desk, labeled sequentially in order, covering the season through the 3rd week of September. The 12th was not there. Neither was Elias Vane. Neither has ever been recovered. The incident report classified the disappearance as probable accident in remote terrain. The Park Service issued a brief internal notice. There was no public statement. Doris Harverson, who was a junior ranger at the district office that fall, and who received a copy of that notice in her interoffice mail, wrote in her FOIA cover letter 34 years later, "I asked my supervisor what had happened to Elias Vane. He told me not to ask that again." I had been in the Park Service long enough by then to know exactly what that meant. It meant that the question had already been answered, and that the answer was not going to be shared with me. The track photographs Vane had sent, the ones from the Eastern Fork mudflat, the ones that prompted his first request for species identification, were not in the released file. The district office communications log shows them received and forwarded to the regional superintendent's office. The regional superintendent's office has no record of receiving them. They are, like the 12th notebook, not there. The space where they should be is as empty and as specifically shaped as the dust outline on that shelf. The archivists who reviewed the released materials as part of Harverson's FOIA action flagged one additional detail that does not appear in any official summary. In the margin of Vane's final recovered field journal entry, the one dated September 27th, 2 days before his last transmission, There is a single line that appears to have been added after the body of the entry was complete. The pencil pressure is different from the surrounding text. The archivist's notation describes it as added at a separate sitting. It reads, "It was there when I woke up, standing at the tree line, just watching." It has been there every morning this week, and I have not written it in the regular entries because I didn't want them to pull me out. I need to see what it does next. I need to understand it. I'm not afraid anymore. I don't know if that's better or worse. Thoroughfare Station was decommissioned in 1961 and the structure removed. The area is now designated wilderness. There is no maintained trail to it. The Park Service does not station personnel in that drainage anymore, which has been explained over the years as a resource allocation decision consistent with modern fire monitoring technology. Doris Harverson visited the site once in the fall of 1989. She hiked in with a retired colleague, and they spent 2 days in the eastern drainage where the tracks had been. She doesn't describe in any available document what they found there or what they didn't find. She says only this in the final paragraph of her FOIA cover letter: "I went there to try to understand what Elias experienced. I came out with a different kind of respect for the places in this world that haven't decided yet what they think of us. I haven't been back. I don't plan to be. The 12th notebook has never been found. Elias Vane has never been found." The eastern drainage of the Thoroughfare region remains among the most remote and infrequently visited terrain in the lower 48 states. Nobody goes out there alone anymore. Nobody who knows anything about it anyway. If any of what Vane recorded sounds familiar to you, if you've worked a remote post, spent real time in deep wilderness, or heard the old-timers in that country talk about the places they wouldn't go, leave a comment. And if you know anything about the eastern drainage or about what the Shoshone elders in that region would not discuss with Park Service personnel in those years, I mean it genuinely when I say I want to know.